Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us as we're letting people in through the waiting room. We'll probably get started in another minute or so. Thank you for being here. So we'll give it just one more minute here and then we'll get started. I think, well, you can read the slide that just went by, that if you do have questions throughout our conversation here, you're welcome to type them into the chat box, and we'll be sure to keep our eyes on that. So this hour goes really, really quickly, so let's get started. My name is Sarah Porter, and I am the Executive Director of Victory Programs. Victory Programs is a Boston-based nonprofit working with individuals and families who've experienced homelessness and addiction, among other chronic health conditions. Thank you for joining us at today's roundtable. Our very first roundtable was early on in our COVID days. And while life has gone back to kind of quote unquote normal in some ways, we have found that this particular format is helpful and enjoyable and reasonably well received. So while we would love to be in the same room with each of you for a lively, engaged conversation, we appreciate you joining in from wherever you are, if you're headed home, if you're making dinner, if you're finishing up something at your desk, wherever you may be, we appreciate your being here and participating in this conversation. So along those lines, I would also say thank you to each of you for being engaged neighbors, good friends, faithful supporters, and generally just helpful humans to us here at Victory Programs and to those who are accessing services through Victory Programs, otherwise known as our clients. So today's topic is commercial sex trade. Our official title includes the subtitle, what Victory Programs is doing to help survivors of human trafficking and sexual exploitation find hope. And while I really love that title, as we got into it, we realized that the conversation deserved to be broader than just Victory Programs, that there are specialists in this field that have been so impressive to me, to us, that we really wanted you to have a chance to experience their expertise as well. So without further ado, let me introduce you to today's panelists, an impressive group for sure. So Melinda, would you start us off? Would you introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and maybe even a few words of what it is that brings you to this work?
Sure. I am Dr. Melinda Javingo, and I'm the Chief Program Officer here at Victory Programs. I've been here for 2 years. I have been working in the field of trying to eliminate child sex trafficking since the mid-'80s of last year. And so I have worked a lot with young people who of course just grow up to see the women that we're seeing today. So part of me is just helping to empower these women to find better choices in their lives and better opportunities as we move forward. And that's what makes me very interested in this work.
Awesome. Thanks, Melinda. Naika.
Hi, everyone. My name is Naika, and I work for Victory Connector as the Assistant Program Director here. What brings me to this work is just the overall well-being of the community. And I've been in this work for about 5 years now.
We're glad to have you, Naika.
Thank you.
Mercy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miss Mercy Dizon of the Bulacan and Kapampangan peoples. I am Chief Matriarch and founder of Sex Workers Against Trafficking, Collaboration for Healing Services. I'm in this work because I myself am a survivor, trafficked out of the states of Washington, Oregon, and Nevada, and I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to represent my community today.
And we're glad to have you here, Mercy. And last but not least, Mary.
Hi, folks. I'm Mary Spetta. I serve as the Executive Director of Amira. We are also in Massachusetts working with Victory programs. We provide exit and aftercare services to female identifying adults who are leaving the commercial sex trade or looking to leave the commercial sex trade. I'm a person of lived experience in commercial sexual exploitation, DV, and child sexual abuse. And I'm also a researcher on the commercial sex trade. My field of expertise is in how prostitution policy impacts people impacted by prostitution.
That is a lot of P's in one sentence, an incredibly impressive. Thank you to all of you. So let's just to set the stage of our conversation here. Victory Programs works quite a bit in a Boston area that's referred to as Mass and Cass. That particular section of the city is known for homeless encampments, open air drug use, extremely high level of need, and I would say human suffering. It's a place where the intersectionality of complex issues is on full display, as well as I would say a place where we can easily see the failure of multiple systems. So I heard a statistic several years ago that in that particular area, there were 60 to 80 individuals being trafficked in Mass and Cass every day. And my first reaction to that statistic was that can't possibly be true. Like nobody's talking about that. And as I thought about it more and listened, I realized I was just in the wrong spot. I was listening in the wrong spot. And as I started to pay closer attention, the depth and the breadth of the issue in our very community was stunning, and has dramatically informed how we, Victory Programs, are working with individuals differently. So to get us started, Mary, I'm going to start with you. Could I ask you to lay out some basic definitions, some terms, and what we're referring to as our preferred language for this particular conversation?
Sure. So when we're talking about sex trafficking, we're talking about the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a commercial sex act. And that is defined legally in different ways. But for service providers, we generally define that as a sex act in exchange for anything of value. So it could be money, but it also could be substances. It could be a place to sleep. It could be food. It could be any number of things that is valuable to an individual. The commercial sex trade is a complicated and nuanced phenomenon that encompasses both sex trafficking and exploitation that exists outside of the legal scope of sex trafficking. It also can include consensual sex trading, though it is the minority of what we see in the commercial sex trade. Roughly 13 to 16% of cases are consensual. And as far as folks who are trading sex, at Amira, we firmly believe in a person-centric approach. And so to that end, we encourage folks to refer to the commercial sex trade and people in it using verbs and not nouns. So we'll talk about people trading sex, and people trade sex for a number of reasons, and they can bounce back and forth as well. It can begin as consensual and then it's non-consensual, or they can be trafficked at one point and then hop out of a trafficking situation, but still are being exploited due to poverty, et cetera. Most folks don't unpack the reasons why they're in the commercial sex trade for many years and even many years after they exit. And so to give folks the opportunity to identify in their humanity first and in actions second, we use verbs to approach the conversation.
I love that idea of identify with your humanity first. Can I push it a little bit here and just the the common word that is often used is prostitution or prostitute. What you did not use that word once in your introduction. Can you talk a little bit why?
Yes. So when I talk about my research, you'll notice with the many P's, I talked about prostitution policy. And that's because as a researcher, I specifically focus on the legal and policy aspects of the commercial sex trade. And the legal definition of it is prostitution. So it's appropriate to use in that legal sense because that's the word we have to use, that we're all on the same page. But the commercial sex trade can encompass more than just prostitution from a legal perspective. And so we're aware of the fact that the people that we're serving could be experiencing a number of things that are not covered under that legal definition. However, we're also thinking about stigma and bias. So even when we're working with folks, if we do have to talk about prostitution, we really try not to use the word prostitute. That word comes with a lot of stigma, and it's been used to degrade individuals for centuries, really. And again, going back to that sense of using verbs instead of nouns, right? That this is a person who is more than just the actions that, or the things that have happened to them. And so prostitution, we try to use that in the legal sense when we have to, but otherwise we're really talking about the commercial sex trade as a phenomenon in whole and avoiding that use of the word prostitute.
Naika, let's move to you to talk a little bit about kind of building off what Mary is saying, that a person is more than the sum of what has happened to them. Naika, you introduced yourself as someone who runs the Victory Connector. It is one of our newest programs here at Victory Programs. Can you talk a little bit about what the connector is, who is coming, who are the women that you're working with, that as I think of that, they are so much more than the sum of their experience, but their experience is helpful to know in this setting. Naika?
Gladly, thank you. So the Connector is a low threshold harm reduction day center for women and trans folks who are actively using and experiencing homelessness in the Mass and Cass area. Some of the services that we provide is we actually have a trans peer support specialist here on site and a sex worker outreach specialist here in-house. And we have groups that we hold so that members are able to talk about their experiences on the Mass and Cass area. And what I can speak to about the lives of the women and trans folks that are living on the streets right now, it's really scary. A majority of our members participate in commercial sex trade and are constantly concerned with their safety. It's almost guaranteed that they will experience some form of sexual assault or sexual abuse while living on the streets, especially when you're involved in the commercial sex trade. So what we do here at the Connector is we try to build communities. We try to educate the women on having safer sex, providing condoms and lubrication, educating them. We also provide free testing, HIV and STI testing on a daily basis. And we also try to connect them to resources. So connecting the resources to sexual exploitation, rape and DV services, and just trying to build skills around just educating women around safer sex in general. We also, which is a really good tool, we listen to our women, and a lot of them who are participating in commercial sex work have had a lot of concerns about people being obviously hurt in the process of commercial sex work. So we provide them with whistles and alarms, seatbelt cutters, so that they can just be able to be safer while they're in the streets.
Thanks, Nika. Melinda and Mary, do you want to talk a little bit about statistics or numbers, or kind of help frame this and what that looks like?
Sure. Mary, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So from a national perspective, when we're looking at sex trafficking, first of all, it's really, really difficult to get an estimate because folks trading sex are considered a hidden population. And it makes sense because folks trading sex, first of all, are either being victimized, or second, being criminalized, or third, both. And so those factors push folks underground, either in hiding because they don't want to face retribution for something that they are either choosing to do or something that is happening to them, or they're, just sort of lost in the shadows under sex trafficking. So that being said, globally, there are 50 million people being trafficked. That's an estimate. The majority qualify under sex trafficking. When we look at the commercial sex trade in the United States, an estimated 1 million people are being trafficked under the legal definition, and an estimated 2 to 4 million people are trading sex in total for whatever reason that may be. A conglomerate of multiple studies in the United States shows that on average, 84% of people trading sex do not do so by choice. They do so because they either are being trafficked or they have a lack of what's called an economic alternative. So if you're not able to provide for yourself, meet your basic needs, stay off the street and avoid withdrawal, then there's a lack of an economic alternative there, which removes the element of choice from the situation. And choice always needs to be involved, otherwise it's not consensual. So the majority of the commercial sex trade, I think it's interesting that we actually call it sex, because if we remove the exchange of something of good or value, we would call that rape. And so it's something to keep in mind when we think about the statistics involved of how many people are trading sex, and the fact that folks who are trading sex, not every transaction is non-consensual and not every transaction is consensual. So it's a very complicated mix of things. When we look at Massachusetts, and so when we kind of dig down into New England a little bit more, the majority of folks trading sex their country of origin is the US. And so when we think about introduction into the commercial sex trade, we're talking about things that can make folks vulnerable for the most part. By and large, people tend to not choose to participate in the commercial sex trade as an opportunity or an option. They're pushed there for some reason. The average age of entry into the commercial sex trade is between 14 and 17 years old in New England. And most folks enter as a result, they have prior experiences with poverty, housing insecurity, substance use, involvement in the foster care system. And people can also enter, outside of that age bracket as adults, younger than 14 years old, et cetera. But in New England, when we look at all of the system gaps that we have, and we look at the systemic racist scaffolding of our legal system, it sets up poor individuals, women and girls of color, and people in the LGBTQIA community to be the primary targets for folks who end up in the commercial sex trade. When we think about it from that trafficking perspective, a trafficker wants to make money. And so what you want to do when you make money is get a product for as cheap as possible. The myth that this is happening to foreign nationals in the US is, while it is happening, it's by and far in the minority. Because why go to another country to get a product when you can go down the street and get a girl who's equally as vulnerable and it's far cheaper? That's the way that a trafficker thinks. So when we look at our communities, we look at the systemic gaps. When we're having these conversations about poverty and homelessness and substance use, we absolutely need to be thinking about the commercial sex trade, because 9 out of 10 times the commercial sex trade is actually a symptom of a larger problem.
Mary, thank you oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mercy.
I just wanted to say that, human trafficking is a crime that exploits vulnerabilities. It's also where we look for it. And one of those vulnerabilities is relationship, just like you were talking about some of the people in foster care and such. So relationship gets us into human trafficking. Relationship is also a protective factor that gets us out.
Great. Thank you. That's exactly what I was going to point out, is that 60 to 98%, and I would say in the research I've done in my career is closer to like 90, 95% of individuals who end up in the commercial sexual trade are people that have been sexually abused in their lives. When I was working with young adults, almost every single person reported being sexually abused as a young child, and they're also trafficked by people they know. So this isn't always just stranger abduction and putting someone out on the streets. It's often kind of generational ways of survival in families and things that you learn. I had a young woman that I knew for many years who had been in the foster care system, who looked at us one day and said, I knew by the age of 8, I was someone's paycheck. And so based on her perception of herself as an economic tool, she began to think, why not just make money on my own, and ended up under the control of a third party. Again, I think it's very important to realize that people don't wake up one day and say, hi, today I'm going to go sell myself and my body in order to be able to eat or put a roof over my head or feed my children. People are forced into choices that are unconscionable, and they're doing the very best they can. And I think that the work we're trying to do in all of our programs is to give people new choices, new options, and being able to see themselves taking different steps to be able to survive. And like Mary said, these are economic choices to start with. And as you get into the commercial sexual industry, what happens is that in order to even tolerate being raped 4 or 5 or 6 times a night, you end up turning to drugs, or you have a trafficker who is addicting you to drugs. And so the intersectionality with homelessness and substance abuse and sex trafficking and victimization is almost interchangeable, especially for women and for people on the LGBTQ spectrum, because oftentimes they are denied the kind of economic opportunities that others maybe have available to them. And so when you get out there and you're having to, sell yourself to survive, you will begin to take substances in order to disassociate from that experience and get through it. Then you turn into someone who is addicted to substances, and then suddenly that's your trafficker. That's what's driving you. You have to sell yourself to have the money to basically keep yourself from going through withdrawal. So it's a very complex cycle, and like Mary said, sometimes there's a third person, sometimes there's not. Either way, there are human beings in our community here in Massachusetts that are buying and selling children, people, human beings as a commodity on our streets, and treating them like they are something that can be thrown away.
Melinda, when running support group for trafficked women for 2 years, we used to say in support group, a trafficker's job is done when we traffic ourselves. And that is so true in terms of being groomed with narcotic restraints, which is a big piece of my story. And just to tack on to some of the statistics, Covenant House has great data on how familial trafficking is actually the predominant relationship to your trafficker, followed by boyfriend, and stranger is the least.
Right. And I think it's also just important that as you're out there on the streets and you're having to make these horrific choices for whatever reason has brought you there, poverty, institutional racism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever has got you in this desperate situation, I always like to say, what is the choice? And we've been talking about this a lot. If you have a plate of dirt or a plate of garbage, is that really a choice for dinner? And so we have to be able to provide more choices for individuals so that they have the opportunities to take better care of themselves and to be able to move forward with their lives.
I want to, Mercy, I want to go to you to talk specifically about this idea of vulnerability, and particularly kind of the trans experience and how that sort of intensifies the vulnerability that both Mary and Melinda were talking about. But I don't want to lose sight of one of the things you said, Melinda, but the idea that there are individuals in our community, just like if I go back to where I was first shocked by the number of individuals being trafficked in Mass and Cass, that took my breath away in that moment. It's easy to say being trafficked. It takes that word purchasing out of the conversation. That's a whole other side, that there are 60 to 80 plus individuals who are purchasing or, are engaged in that side of the commercial sex trade as well.
Actually, it's much higher than that, because if you have 60 or 80 women out there and they're being bought and sold 4 or 5 times a night, you're talking in the hundreds
Right.
of people on any given night driving around the streets looking for children, looking for individuals who are in these vulnerable situations, and buying them or paying them or abusing them into having sex.
Or coercing, I'm guessing.
Or coercing them, yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Mercy, can you continue to talk a little bit about vulnerability and particularly, the trans experience and how that intensifies the vulnerability towards commercial sex trade industry?
Absolutely. And again, trafficking is a crime that exploits vulnerability. It's right where we look for it. It is a no discriminatory oppressor. I myself come from a military family. My dad is a 25-year Navy chief. He is trained in every kind of weapon. He's trained in most of the Pac West fleet in those weapons. I'm not the family to mess with. And yet I was trafficked at 14 and didn't know I was in the sex trade until I was 19. For 5 years, I had been trafficked to over 1,000 men by that point in time. So regardless of a person's experience, we have to affirm what their opinions and beliefs about that experience. I fully believe that was my boyfriend and that he loved me because having experienced sexual abuse, having experienced multiple forms of abuse and violence in my life, it was something I was very familiar with. When we look at the transgender experience, I transitioned later in my life, so I just want to be very clear about my experience and the delineation of that as a transgender woman and my experience as a young boy being trafficked. So I've experienced sex work as a transgender woman with various forms of exploitation within it, but not a clear-cut third-party trafficker, just to be very clear. We look at the obfuscation of LGBTQ type plus people, which is not just within commercial sex exploitation, but across the board within our society. We just don't like to look at ourselves, and say, this is just where we see ourselves when we don't see ourselves. And when I say that, I mean, this is our children, these are our communities. I look at the US Trans Survey as one of the key pieces of data that informs me. It's a survey of over 27,000 respondents nationwide by transgender people, for transgender people, and it shows up to 64% of transgender women of color depend on the sex work for income in the last year. When we look at other data sets, this does not appear. We don't have that same representation. And again, human trafficking is a crime that exploits vulnerability. So when we reach out for help, who do we reach out for? We reach out to social service agencies, like wonderful work y'all are doing over at Mass and Cass. And in order to provision that work, we need the data to establish need. And that's really where we see a total systems failure. Having worked within the system for 10 years as an advocate in various forms, whether it be in a nonprofit realm or with it as a systems advocate, I frequently received calls about total systems failure for particularly transgender women of color, although all gender diverse people experience this marginalization and oppression. Things like attempting to file a police report and that police report not being taken, and not saying that that's anyone's fault at all, just saying that this is the fact of the matter. These are the calls that I staffed and took. I didn't know what to do in the moment either. It feels like an impossible situation that shouldn't be occurring. And for whatever reason, whether it be the individual presented as erratic or of a high mental health need, whatever it may be, trauma is always messy. Human trafficking survivors don't show up with a pretty bow and a smile on our face. We show up as a mess because my body as a child and anyone's body was never made to contain such tragedy, And so can we blame the person for breaking? These calls just do not make its way through the system. We are frequently found without any support because we don't have the social services to support us. We don't have housing services that support us or provide care. Even myself, going to jail, they don't know where to place you. So every system has touched my life. Social services, the court system, criminal justice system does not know how to handle a transgender person. Legal name change, gender change or not. And it's no one's fault. These are very well-intended people seeking to serve. I know in my heart of hearts, I've worked with amazing detectives. I've worked with incredible social workers and nurses and doctors across the board. with a heart of service. But it's not withstanding that we have to have these conversations and we have to trust one another if we want to see this area improve.
Okay, thank you, Mercy. Naika, can I ask you a follow-up question about that? Is the women you work at the connector, women and trans and non-binary individuals who come and access the connector, I'm assuming that when people come in, just like Mercy's talking about, they're not coming in presenting, I am a victim of the commercial sex trade. They're not coming in and starting with, I'm being trafficked. They're starting with what? Like, you've now worked with women, some of those women probably for close to a year, and you're just getting to that point of a conversation, right? That's usually secondary, if at all.
Right. I'll just second what Mercy said. It's all about trust and building community. At the connector, I'm blessed to have a really amazing team here who really appreciates the work. And from the beginning, when I first started here, I noticed one difference from any other program I've ever been a part of. These women, they trust our team. They trust the connector. They come here with their problems, their issues, and, they talk about how there's no other place that they would rather come and, spill all their baggage. They do come, as Mercy said, a mess, and we come to them with wide open arms and we let them talk about all of it, the full story, the full scope, no matter how long that takes or what that looks like. We don't give up on these women and they don't give up on us. And that's why the Connect is a really special place. You'll hear about our name in the community, the women, the trans folks, and even the guys that, they come with their women sometimes and they'll tell us, hey, my girl, and I'm talking about men who are possibly, yeah, exactly. And they'll talk about how the connector is a great place for their woman, and that speaks volumes, so we know that whenever the person is ready to change, they know that they can trust us and come to us and say, hey, I'm ready to exit, and we have the resources ready and waiting for them. And that's what makes the connector special.
Everybody has a story, right?
Yeah.
Including the abuser. And one thing I wanted to say, I'll keep it really short, is that it's a privilege to be a victim. I know every time I was sexually assaulted in the game, in the life, whatever you want to call it, I didn't have time to heal from that. I couldn't go to the doctor. Are you crazy? I had to go turn another date. I had to go survive. And so to say that I'm going to choose to be a victim today is not on the table for most of us. It's not going to be presented that way.
Your knowledge of statistics is phenomenal. So let me ask this question. Like, if we think about the world today being a place where I would say there is more inequity, that people are more vulnerable, that, we often will talk about that COVID pushed more people kind of further into the margin. Are the numbers increasing as they relate to people engaged in or people connected to commercial sex trade?
No, if I can jump in here. The numbers are not increasing, the reports are increasing.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
So that old adage that prostitution is the world's oldest profession is something that I very much reject. And as a researcher, and a lot of my research focuses on the history of prostitution policy as well. When we go back to the earliest records that we have of prostitution, which are, some of them date back 3,000-4,000 years. Ever since then, prostitution has always targeted people with a vulnerability. So the people who are in the lowest social class, getting into like temple prostitution or something like that was like the thing that kept you alive and off the street and out of poverty. So we think about like those impoverished folks, et cetera. Within the US, we have data, empirical studies from 1888 that show that the majority of people that were being studied and looked at the time, that they had underlying vulnerabilities before they entered the commercial sex trade. And yet they were characterized as having a moral failure. In 1907, Congress commissioned the first congressional report on prostitution, what was termed white slavery, actually, because as soon as trafficking of white women and girls sort of came to the topic of conversation, because it had been happening to Black women and Black women and girls and brown women and girls under chattel slavery very regularly under the fancy trade. Once it started happening to white women and girls, then all of a sudden there was this conversation and action. And that 1907 report showed that prostitution was primarily linked to a lack of affordable housing, a lack of living wage jobs, and a lack of adequate medical care, which are that has remained true over the past century. Even, there are reports in the 1920s and 1930s when prostitution first became criminalized in the different states in the US, characterizing it as a moral failure of people trading sex. Instances where 30,000 individuals were arrested in New York City within 1 month for participating in prostitution. And so when we look at like the data over history, it's characterized in different ways. It's collected and presented in different ways. And, it's only been since 2000 that the definition of human trafficking and it being, prosecutable in the US has even come into existence. The methods by which human trafficking happens today were not covered under the 13th Amendment. And so there was no way to prosecute them, even though human trafficking was still happening, and it was an extension of slavery and chattel slavery, just morphing into different things. And so we have a different language for it now than we did even 25 years ago. And we had different language for it in the 60s, and we had different language for it in the late 19th century. And so the thing to remember is when we look at reports, that 50 million number globally, that increased 25% in 5 years. And I highly doubt that the number of people increased that much. It was just our ability to collect reports and create enough awareness for people to call tip lines and to get into different operations to make those estimates, doing population estimates. We had more data to do that. But as far as vulnerabilities exist, et cetera, they still absolutely, they've never changed. We're just all of a sudden aware of it in a very different way. And what we're becoming more and more aware of now that folks of us who have experienced the commercial sex trade know, but folks outside of the commercial sex trade don't necessarily know, is that not only are there variations of vulnerability in entering, but there's variations of vulnerability within the commercial sex trade. There is a gradation of privilege. So women who look like me have the most amount of privilege in the commercial sex trade. We experience far fewer extreme acts of violence. The sex acts that we have to perform tend to not be as extreme as folks at the other end of the privilege spectrum, which are women and girls of color, trans folks. Those folks experience more violence. They're less likely to make it out of the commercial sex trade. They're less likely to be offered exit services that are culturally sensitive and appropriate for their identities and their expression. And therefore, the reports that we get tend to be of cases that look like me. And so what we're seeing among service providers and among law enforcement is more and more of an awareness that the majority of folks that are being exploited are actually folks who have minority identities. And so the more we create awareness about that, the more those reports come to the surface.
You are real spicy here. It's brought up so much for me. I want to, where do I start? If we want to see an increase in reporting, you might not expect to hear this from me, but we need an increase in funding for trafficking specific detectives. The people I work with, they want to do this work. They want to investigate a wide variety of trafficking cases across all genders and identities. But when you're assigned to like homicide, sexual assault, and like 5 other crimes, it becomes incredibly challenging to run an effective operation. And you have to take certain types of cases. And that's not my expertise, but it's been my experience working alongside our amazing law enforcement advocates and officers. So again, we need to increase in funding for trafficking specific detectives, and that's for the safety of the officers as well as the safety of our survivors that we're working with, who will be in harm's way if we don't have the adequate manpower or woman power for that. I wanted to also highlight a decolonized approach to this. There is no word for prostitution, sex work, human trafficking in my native language, pre-colonization, so pre-Western contact in Alibatan. There's no word or concept of it. And the University of Arizona did a study with Alelo Hawaii, which is the indigenous language of Hawaii, of Kanaka people. And there's no word there either before Western contact. So what we see is a decolonized approach in indigenous societies where we all have protocols and ways of being outside of exploitation, and we value people over profits or commercialization of things. There's no need for exploitation or the sex trade. It really does come from colonization. I also wanted to highlight real quick that Sesta Fosta is twofold. For one, for me having been adjacent to outreach on the track here, where women walk, we had an exponential increase after Sesta Fosta. What I did also find is I personally assisted 2 women in receiving multi-million-dollar settlements under Sesta Fosta. One of them is doing amazing today. All of these are white women who do look like Mary. And in one case, it didn't matter at all. She received multi-millions of dollars. She was so inundated in the game, a trafficker quickly gained control of those funds. And it did not support her. Again, the vulnerability isn't always just financial. We are whole people. And when you grow up in the game, having touched millions of dollars with your body, you can't just walk away from it, even if you do have millions of dollars.
That phrase was new to me up until 6 months ago, that the idea of the game. Mary, can you talk a little bit more about that? I know you introduced yourself as someone with lived experience, how that lived experience has informed your work, and how that concept of the game has, how that has lived in your life.
Yeah, so out here on the East Coast, we generally use the term the life, and the game we hear a lot on the West Coast, which makes a lot of sense. Just considering where Mercy is geographically. So in our work, most of the folks that we're serving would use the term the life, and it's really a term to sort of separate a lifestyle from what would be considered like mainstream, or what folks of lived experience would call a square life, where it's, you sort of have your like cookie cutter monogamous relationships and your traditional jobs and traditional ways of making money, etc. And the life encompasses not only trading sex, but it can encompass, for different people's experiences, it can encompass a lot more than that, beyond just trading sex, as far as, using substances, the combination of substances and trading sex. There can be almost a microcosm community within what are called stables, which is when a pimp or a trafficker is running multiple people at a time, and there's that stable, and that's sort of like your centric zone for the life, etc. And so when we're talking about like entering and exiting the commercial sex trade, these are terms that we use as service providers or policymakers, people on the outside, to describe a phenomenon that we're working with, but it's not language that we use actually in the commercial sex trade. That's language of, doing dates, turning tricks, in the life, leaving the life, going back into the life, those kinds of things. And so a lot of times we can you know, we have these conversations and we have them at like such a high level that then we have to do this language translation between what we're describing, sort of so that the general community can understand what's going on, but then kind of breaking it down to an individual level of talking to folks and getting an understanding of what's going on in their world, and they're going to use different language for that. And so the term the life or the game is reflective of that reality.
And can I just say, you don't have to have understanding to have compassion for somebody, you know? And so often I've trained across the nation. I've trained hospitals across the nation. I've trained a variety of organizations, government and non-government alike. And so many people are focused on the language. If I'm coming to you and you're a square and you wear cargo shorts and you show up like 20 minutes early, that's not me. And that's why I need you. So I really don't need you to know everything about how I talk and this, that, and the other thing. Like, you're focused in an area that's really self-focused. It's about your own insecurity about engaging with me. It's not really that focused on me. So I want to encourage people to do a paradigm shift there. Again, you don't have to have total understanding to have compassion. Be yourself. Show up early. Have snacks in your cargo shorts or whatever you put in there. I don't know. But
you know, Mercy, I guess you just froze on us, so I'm going to jump in here for a quick second, because I do think that one of the things that Mercy and Mary are getting to is that the community's understanding of why people end up in these situations is important, because taking away the stigma of oh, I woke up this morning and, you know, or I'm a drug addict, I need to sell myself for drugs. Understanding the why and the trauma involved is something that will actually help the community, because it allows people to think differently about what they're witnessing when they drive through what we call mass and cash here. When we walk in the connector, you're not just looking at, you know, quote unquote, drug addicts who, you know, sell themselves for dope. That's not who you're seeing. You have to see what's behind those behaviors in order to understand and to be able to serve these individuals. So one of the things, Naika, I go in the connector quite often, and one of the most beautiful things I see is that we've set up this makeup mirror. I mean, it's a whole wall of a mirror with little lights around it, right? Sounds super silly to those of us, you know, who very like, God, these women have so many bigger problems. But the fact that they can take a moment and be a human being and be able to sit there with a friend, just like any other young girl or young person or human being, and put on their makeup and laugh, that is the kind of dignity that we have to afford people in order to help them heal. And that is one of the things that we're trying to do at the Connector, is educate all of our staff, educate each other, educate our community on who these women are, who these individuals are, how they ended up here, why these are their choices that they've been given, and how can we provide them with opportunities to be able to adopt a different framework about their experience, about understanding in a different way what's happening to them, and being able to take more control over their lives and their experience. And that's really what we're trying to do at the Connector, is give a modicum of dignity and respect to what these women have gone through, and how we can help them recognize their value and their opportunity. So that's, you know, one of the things I really wanted to talk about is it's the little things that make a huge difference.
Naika, do you want to follow up on that? Do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, the what of what you guys are doing and how you attempt to inspire hope for women?
Yes, I agree with a lot of what Melinda said. We here at the Connector, we meet our members where they're at. You know, we have about over 244 members at this point. And our members can come in, do their makeup. You know, they can come in and have a cup of coffee and hang out with us. We have a whole TV room for them to watch movies on. It's just an amazing experience when you come from sleeping on the streets at Max and Cass, and you can come into the Connector and just be a human and be treated like one, you know? So again, everything that Melinda said is it's perfect. That's exactly what we do here at the Connector. And the women, they can come here and just get a piece of them, feel at home, you know, and that's what we try to do.
Awesome. I hope the team that's helping us run this roundtable on the back is keeping an eye out for Mercy to come back. It seems like Mercy may have had a connected issue or a internet issue. I'm hoping she's going to join us again. Melinda, can you talk just a little, I mean, we're focusing on the Connector because it is a new program. It's such a special place. Nahika is doing such a fantastic job over there. But that is not the only place where Victory Programs is interacting with individuals who are connected to this issue. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I think that since I arrived here and began to observe all of our programs, what we see across the board is individuals who've had to make horrible choices in order to be able to survive. And the women that we serve and trans individuals throughout, we serve almost 3,500 people a year. Most of the women that we have seen have had some kind of encounter with domestic violence, gender-based violence, lack of housing because of, you know, addiction, et cetera. And so one of the things that we are trying to do, like I said, is educate not just our street-based programs, but our recovery-based programs, our shelter, our family shelter programs, because, you know, we lost a woman not a year and a half ago who lost her child, went back on the streets and died that night. I mean, you know, it is throughout all of our services that these individuals are within our purview. And so one of the things is to be aware so that we know how to talk to women, how to help them feel comfortable sharing that with us. In light of that, we are also trying to figure out two things. One, how can we improve housing resources for these individuals? So we've applied for and hopefully we'll be receiving a grant to open up a transitional living program that will be attached to rapid rehousing money. And our goal is, thank you, Mary, spat up there, that we'll be able to partner with Mary's team to actually place these women somewhat out of our community here and in another community where they can find some stability and safety and begin to practice a new life, a new identity in a community that may not, you know, recognize them from their previous life. We're also looking at developing employability programs because, you know, I think we talked about it earlier. If you you cannot take away someone's economic stability or economic plan, if you will, as I think ironic as that sounds to probably the community, without giving them something in return in order to substitute that. We don't get unemployment if you leave the life. You know, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure that, you know, I think we ought to fight more for that. But people aren't given unemployment for walking away from something that is so traumatizing and violent. And so we have to be able to offer opportunities for people to be able to have a different way to economically sustain themselves. So new housing, new employment opportunities, new partnerships, and new resources in healthcare, I think, are the areas that we can do the best with, helping our healthcare partners not put on two pair of gloves when someone comes in and says they're in the sex trade. I've seen it myself. You know, they say what they do. They say, oh, that's a terrible thing to be doing. And you watch people in healthcare put on two sets of gloves. It is humiliating for individuals. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is both educate our community, our own staff, but also provide new opportunities for those individuals.
Could I touch on something that you talked about, Melinda, there about exiting and, you know, not getting in that unemployment check? Absolutely. The other element of this as well is criminalization. Is so many people, I get the question all the time of why doesn't she just leave? She's not shackled to a radiator somewhere. First of all, there's a lot of interpersonal, you know, issues involved that are similar to domestic violence as far as trauma bonding and coercion and those kinds of things. But there's also a very practical issue here. 9 out of 10 prostitution arrests in the United States are of the person selling sex, not of the buyer. And they face far more severe sentencing than sex buyers do. And traffickers and pimps are even less likely to be prosecuted and to have a case built against them. And that, you know, then when we think back to that 84% number, roughly 84% of folks are trading sex and they don't want to. And then they're leaving or attempting to leave the commercial sex trade with a criminal record. And they were criminalized for doing something they had to do in order to survive. So our criminal justice system is criminalizing people for survival. And it's telling them you can't be doing prostitution anymore. But then with that criminal record, they go and try to get a job, and they have prostitution or solicitation or common night walking on their record. And that comes with a ton of stigma. And you have to then sit in an interview and try to explain away your criminal record and pray to the heavens that the person in front of you is going to bless you with an economic opportunity. You get that job, and then that person exploits you because they know about your criminal record, and you don't want them blabbing to everybody else in the office or in your workspace about your criminal record. And so then maybe you comply, and the cycle of exploitation just continues. And that's even if you do get a job that pays even minimum wage. But when we're talking about, in our area, Massachusetts, we have the 5th highest rental prices in the country. When we talk about housing here is extraordinarily high, and we have a 200,000 unit shortage of affordable housing units. And so you try to get a job that pays a livable wage that can pay for your housing with a criminal record. That's nearly impossible. And yet we're telling folks by giving them a criminal record that you can't be in the commercial sex trade. It's people end up back in the commercial sex trade not wanting to be there simply because they can't get out, or they can't get an apartment with that record. They can't volunteer at their kids' school. They can't get into certain educational opportunities. Nearly every state has a laundry list of licenses and certifications that you cannot get if you have prostitution or solicitation on your criminal record. So that's another huge barrier that we have to leap with folks as far as service providers go, is trying to find opportunities for them to hop out of that. Thankfully, we have a great bill in Massachusetts right now in the Judiciary Committee that hopefully is going to get voted out of the committee into the floor and pass, that will decriminalize people trading sex and completely expunge everything related to prostitution off of their records. And if that passes, it just passed, something similar passed in Maine. If that happens in Massachusetts, that'll make this process of exit and providing services a lot easier, because you're not having to face that criminal record barrier. But until we do that, it's just going to become worse and worse and worse.
We're almost out of time here. Mercy, can I kick it to you here? If you had to say, people who are listening, how can they help? How can they learn? How can they prevent? What's your advice to the individuals who've joined this conversation?
Rarely can anything be changed in a reaction or incidental response, and it is important for me, I think, to understand like the transgender experience is going to be total systems failure. We need to advocate consistently. This is a long game, right? This isn't a short response. It's not something you're going to accomplish this weekend, next year, next 5 years. This is, again, a long societal game. For me, I can think about as a transgender woman fleeing from abuse myself. Listen with compassion for sure, Brenda. There's nothing you can do when people just do not follow the law. Like even with a DV order, fleeing from DV myself, and other forms of abuse, what can you do when the apartment turns the electricity off and you can't do anything? You can't sue them. They have a lot of money. What can you do when you have a housing award and you can get a year of housing, but they call your reference at the apartment complex and they share whatever they want to share, and you don't get that housing, regardless, irrespectful to your award? What do you do when you made $37 an hour and you can't get a job making half your salary in positions you used to supervise? What do you do but turn a couple days? And in my own experience, just to be transparent, that's what I've had to do. In all my privilege, with all my education, I have a bachelor degree. I have tens of thousands of dollars professional development poured into me. I have been a program director, fundraised $550,000 in 1 year, this, that, and the other thing, and had to turn dates because human trafficking is a crime that exploits vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Mercy. Melinda, I'll give you the last 30 seconds. What would you like people to know about helping, learning, preventing?
Check your bias.
That we're biased.
Check your bias. Check your judgment. take a moment to pause when you walk by someone on the street that you then want to, make all kinds of assumptions. Check your assumptions. And remember that every individual out there is a human being that is deserving of dignity. And it is our job as a community to embrace people with compassion and to work together to help give everyone the kind of opportunities they need so that no one has to be bought and sold on our streets.
Thank you. Every time I have these conversations with you all, I'm a bit of an emotional mess. I'm devastated by what I'm learning. I'm so proud to know people like you who are doing this work. So proud of the work that we as an organization are doing and the learning we're doing and leaning into this. Thank you all for your time, for your expertise, for your compassion and your dedication. To those of you who have joined us for this conversation and are listening, thanks for spending an hour with us, learning and thinking about what we're doing here. I'm sure there will be a follow-up email that comes around to those of you who have been on this call. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your partnership, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.